It was late August in suburban Maryland, the kind of evening when the sun melts into orange haze and the streets glow gold for a moment before darkness sets in. The neighborhood of Ridgeway Heights looked like something out of a postcard, quiet, tree-lined, kids on bikes, sprinklers ticking away on manicured lawns. On most days, it was peaceful, predictable, safe. But on that night, the peace didn't last. Something small, something ordinary, was about to spiral into something raw, loud, and ugly. The streetlights had just flickered on when Jamal Turner cut through the park on his way home. He was 16, lanky and tall, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and music playing low through his earbuds. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just heading home after basketball practice, sweat drying on his forehead, his jersey peeking out under a gray hoodie. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of rain lingered even though the sky had cleared hours ago. His world was simple. Finish school, stay out of trouble, make his mom proud. Jamal's mother, Special Agent Renee Turner, had worked for the FBI for nearly 12 years. She was respected, sharp, and carried herself with a kind of calm confidence that made people listen when she spoke. But to Jamal, she was just Mom. The woman who left the house before dawn, who missed a few games because of work emergencies, who sometimes came home with tired eyes but always made time to ask about his day. She raised him alone since his father's passing, something that hardened her but never dimmed her warmth when it came to him. He was her anchor, her reason. The street Jamal walked that night was one he knew well. He passed the same convenience store with the flickering neon sign, the same broken mailbox that the homeowners association never got around to fixing. He walked this route 100 times. But this time a patrol car sat parked at the corner, lights off, engine humming softly. 2 officers inside, bored, restless, looking for something that looked like trouble. From far away, Jamal might have looked like that. A tall black teen in a hoodie walking alone at night, head down. The kind of image some people have been taught to fear before they even understand why. Inside the car, Officer Barnes adjusted his seat, eyes narrowing as Jamal crossed the street under the dim streetlight. "You see that?" he muttered. His partner, Officer Keene, didn't answer at first, but he followed his gaze. "Yeah," Keene said finally. "Could be nothing, but it could be something." Jamal noticed the car when it started rolling slowly behind him. He pulled one earbud out, the sound of tires crunching over gravel tightening his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been stopped, but something about this night felt different. The street was too quiet. The air is too heavy. His heart picked up as he tried to keep his pace steady. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't even thinking about anything except home and a hot shower. But in that moment, his presence was enough to draw suspicion. The way he walked, the color of his hoodie, the shade of his skin. Renee was still at the field office, wrapping up a report on a cybercrime case when her phone buzzed with a call from a neighbor. The words she heard froze her blood. "Your boy, there's a situation on Maple Street. The police got him stopped. They're shouting at him." Her pen dropped. The air in the room went still. Back on Maple Street, the situation was already spiraling. Jamal had done what he was told, hands up, no sudden moves. But the flashlight in his face, the harsh tone of the officers' voices, the hands on their holsters, it made his pulse throb in his ears. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare speak too quickly. "Where are you coming from?" one of them asked. "Basketball practice," Jamal said quietly. "I live right down the street." "Mind showing us what's in your bag?" Jamal hesitated. "It's just my clothes, shoes." "Bag now." He did as told, moving slowly, but the sound of the zipper, the movement of his arm, made one officer flinch. It was almost imperceptible, but Jamal saw it. He saw the flash of tension, the split second of mistrust, and he knew deep down that one wrong move could change everything. What the officers didn't know, couldn't have known, was that his mother, the woman who trained law enforcement officers across the state, who lectured about de-escalation and bias awareness, was already on her way. Renee's car tore through the quiet streets, the GPS voice drowned under the rush of her pulse. Every second felt like a lifetime. The image in her head, her son's face under police lights, hands raised, scared, burned behind her eyes. She'd seen too many cases like this. She'd read too many reports, attended too many funerals. But this time it wasn't someone else's child. It was hers. Maple Street was lit up when she arrived. Red and blue lights flashing against the darkened homes, curious faces peeking from behind curtains. Jamal stood there, frozen, his bag on the ground, surrounded by 2 officers. One hand hovered near a holster. Renee didn't stop to think. She stepped out of her car, badge in hand, voice sharp and clear as it cut through the air. "That's my son." The words landed like a gunshot. The officers turned, their postures snapping stiff. For a moment, silence filled the air. Recognition flickered in their eyes as they saw the badge, the name, the authority. Jamal didn't move, still caught between fear and disbelief. Renee's presence was both a relief and a heartbreak. She shouldn't have to be here like this, not as an agent, not as a mother. But in that moment, the two worlds she'd spent her life keeping separate collided under the flashing lights. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted. The officers froze, stammering through explanations that didn't make sense. They said they were responding to suspicious activity, that there had been reports. But the truth hung in the air, thick and undeniable. It wasn't the bag, it wasn't the hoodie, it was the boy. As neighbors began to film from their porches, as Renee stood between her son and two armed men who had misjudged everything about him, the quiet world of Ridgeway Heights cracked open. What began as another evening in a perfect suburb had become something else entirely, a story about fear, power, and the people caught between them. And though the night ended without blood, something irreversible had already happened. The fragile sense of safety, of fairness, was gone. What came next would test not only a mother's strength, but the system she'd spent her life serving. After that night on Maple Street, nothing in Ridgeway Heights felt normal again. For Jamal, the flashing lights and the cold edge in those officers' voices stayed with him like a scar. Even though his mother had stepped in before anything irreversible happened, the memory replayed in his mind every time he heard a siren, every time a patrol car passed too slowly. The world around him hadn't changed, but his place in it suddenly felt different, smaller, fragile. At school, the whispers started. Someone's parent had seen the video, just a short clip filmed from a porch, posted online, spreading like wildfire before anyone could stop it. It showed Jamal standing under the harsh blue lights, hands up, his face caught between fear and confusion. It didn't show his mother's arrival or the silence that followed. It didn't show the apology. It showed just enough for people to make up their own stories. Some kids looked at him with sympathy, others with suspicion. One afternoon, while Jamal was getting water after gym class, a classmate muttered, "Guess you got lucky your mom's FBI, huh?" The tone was half joke, half resentment, and it hit him harder than it should have. He didn't respond. He just walked away, trying to hold the pieces of himself together. Renee, meanwhile, was fighting her own battles. The department launched an internal review of the officers' actions, a phrase she'd heard too many times in her career. The same patterns always repeated, statements, reports, silence. And now she was caught between two roles that no longer fit together. At work, she was Agent Turner, expected to stay professional, detached, and rational. At home, she was a mother watching her son flinch at the sound of a police radio. Behind closed doors, she was angry, furious even, but she didn't show it. Instead, she poured that fury into work, longer hours, more cases, fewer nights at home. She told herself it was to stay strong, to keep her position, to protect Jamal. But deep down, it was also because she didn't know how to face what happened. She didn't know how to tell her son that she'd spent her career believing in a system that nearly swallowed him whole. The two officers, Barnes and Keene, weren't untouched either. The viral video brought scrutiny. Local news caught on. Protesters appeared near the station with signs calling for accountability. Barnes' name leaked online, and social media was flooded with angry comments. He told himself he'd done nothing wrong, that he was just doing his job, that people were overreacting. But in private, the guilt was starting to eat at him. Still, instead of facing it, he turned defensive. Angry, he told his partner, "This is what happens when you hesitate. You get punished for trying to keep people safe." Keene didn't answer. He wasn't as sure anymore. He replayed that night in his head over and over, remembering the way Jamal's voice trembled, the look on Renee's face when she showed her badge. He'd seen fear before, but not like that, not from someone who was supposed to trust them. Weeks passed, but the tension didn't fade. It grew, spreading through the neighborhood like a quiet infection. Ridgeway Heights wasn't the same polite, smiling suburb it used to be. Lines were drawn, neighbors who supported Renee and those who thought she'd played the race card. People avoided eye contact at the grocery store. PTA meetings turned into shouting matches. It wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about everything people had been too polite to say for years. For Jamal, the worst part was how the world suddenly saw him as something to discuss instead of someone to know. His coach tried to keep him focused on basketball, but even on the court, he felt watched. A few parents complained about him being on the team, saying the attention might bring problems. One even said they didn't want their kids around that situation. At home, he started avoiding mirrors. His hoodie, once just a piece of comfort, now felt like a target. He tried talking to his mom, but she was always exhausted. Their conversations became shorter, more strained. When he finally snapped and asked, "Why'd this have to happen to me?" she couldn't answer. She just stood there, eyes full of pain she couldn't fix. Meanwhile, Barnes found himself under investigation, not for misconduct, but for procedural errors. It was the kind of bureaucratic phrasing that could end a career without ever nomming the real issue. His resentment toward Renee grew quietly. He blamed her for embarrassing him, for making it personal. In his mind, she wasn't a mother defending her child. She was a federal agent who humiliated him in front of his peers. That resentment festered. He started digging, casually at first, then obsessively. He asked around about Renee at the precinct, checked internal systems he wasn't supposed to access. He told himself he was just curious, but the truth was darker. He wanted something to hold against her, something that would make the scales feel balanced again. Keene noticed the change. "You need to let this go," he warned. "You're making it worse." Barnes just laughed bitterly. "You think she's letting it go? She made us look like racists on camera. My wife's getting hate mail, my kid's getting bullied at school, and you want me to just move on?" That night he drove past Renee's house. Just once, just to see it. Lights off, curtains drawn. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling. He told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong, but something inside him had already crossed a line. Renee sensed it too, the way cars sometimes slowed outside her home. The way she felt was to leave the office. She'd been trained to recognize threats, and this wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. But she didn't tell anyone, not her superiors, not Jamal. She didn't want to sound like she was losing control. Instead, she doubled down at work, taking on high-stress cases that kept her mind busy. But the cracks were showing. Her colleagues noticed she was snapping at people more often, losing focus during briefings. One night after everyone had left, she sat alone in her office, staring at a report she couldn't finish. Her hands were shaking. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel in control. At home, Jamal's silence grew heavier. He stopped going to the park, stopped meeting friends. The only time he felt free was during late-night runs when the streets were empty and the world didn't feel like it was watching him, but even that came with risk. One night while running past a street corner, he noticed a car pull out slowly behind him. Same sound, same pattern. He froze for a second, heart pounding, then forced himself to keep running. He didn't look back until he reached home, hands trembling as he unlocked the door. When he told his mom about it the next morning, she brushed it off gently, told him it was probably nothing. But he could tell she didn't believe her own words. By then, the FBI's internal tension was growing, too. Renee's case reviews were delayed, her superiors asking pointed questions about her professional judgment after the Maple Street incident. It didn't matter that she'd done nothing wrong. Politics didn't care about justice. She was becoming a liability in their eyes, and she could feel it. And Barnes, suspended and angry, was spiraling. He'd lost his badge temporarily, and his marriage was strained to breaking. His anger needed a direction, and every road led back to Renee, the woman who'd made him the face of a controversy he never asked for, the woman who had power he could never touch. When he saw her again, by chance at a gas station late one evening, something in him cracked. She was alone, wearing plain clothes, unaware he was even there. He watched her for a moment too long, then drove off. But the thought stayed, gnawing at him. She took everything from me. Why should she walk free? At the same time, Jamal's breaking point came quietly. A teacher asked him to give a reflection speech about the importance of respect between law enforcement and the community. It was meant to be inspiring. But standing there, looking out at faces that didn't really understand, he couldn't do it. His voice caught halfway through, and he just walked out. That night, Renee found him sitting outside, staring at the street. He finally said what he'd been holding in since that night. "You always told me if I just followed the rules, I'd be safe, but I did, and I was." It broke her. She tried to answer, but the truth between them had already changed. The trust that used to hold their world together was slipping away, piece by piece. Everywhere around them, the tension was tightening like a wire ready to snap. The neighborhood watched, the city whispered, and behind closed doors, the people at the center of it all were unraveling. Renee's world, her son, her career, her belief in the system, was collapsing under the weight of something she'd spent years trying to fight from the inside. And Barnes, consumed by bitterness, was quietly planning a way to make her pay. The air in Ridgeway Heights felt different now. Heavy, charged, like a storm was coming that no one could stop. It was raining the night everything came undone. The kind of cold, steady rain that turns streets into mirrors and makes the whole world seem quiet, too quiet. The storm had rolled in without warning, and with it came the moment that would shatter what was left of their fragile peace. Ridgeway Heights, that perfect little suburb, was once again about to make the news. But this time, no one would be standing under flashing lights. Someone would be lying beneath them. Renee had stayed late at the office again. Her desk lamp was the only one still burning in the empty building, papers scattered like fallen leaves. She'd been going over reports, not because she needed to, but because work was the only thing that still made sense. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. Her phone buzzed once, a text from Jamal. Heading out for a run, be home in 30. She frowned at the screen. It was almost 10 p.m. The streets were slick, the sky restless. She started to type, "Don't go out now, it's raining," but stopped halfway. She said no too many times lately. She didn't want to be the warden in her son's life, so she just replied, "Okay, be careful." Jamal pulled his hoodie tighter as he jogged down Maple Street. The rain came down harder, mixing with the rhythm of his footsteps. It wasn't about exercise anymore. It was about release. Every step felt like a way to outrun the noise, the whispers, the constant reminder that one night had changed everything. He had his music low, just enough to drown out his thoughts, but not enough to miss the world around him. That's when he saw it, a pair of headlights behind him, too close, moving too slow, the same sound, the same hum. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a car follow him since that night, but this one didn't turn off. It kept a steady distance, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Inside that car was Officer Barnes. His face was pale under the dashboard light, jaw clenched tight, eyes locked on the figure in the rain. He hadn't planned this. Not exactly. He told himself he was just driving, just watching. But when he saw the boy, the anger he'd been burying for weeks came surging back like a flood. He'd lost everything. His suspension was about to become permanent. His wife had left with their daughter, and the department had made him the scapegoat. Every headline used his name like a curse. And all of it, every humiliation, started with that night with her and her son. He told himself he just wanted to talk, to make it clear how much damage they'd done. But as he followed Jamal through the rain, that lie started to rot away. Jamal turned down a side street, narrow, darker, lined with old oaks that made the road feel like a tunnel. His heartbeat quickened. The car was still there. He stopped under a flickering streetlight and turned, his voice trembling. "Why are you following me?" Barnes didn't answer right away. He stepped out of the car, rain drenching his uniform jacket. His badge was gone, his authority stripped, but the habit of power still clung to him. He tried to sound calm, but his voice cracked. "You and your mother think you can ruin a man's life, huh? You think there aren't consequences?" Jamal took a step back. "I don't even know you like that, man. I didn't do anything." The rain hissed between them. The sound of it filled the silence that followed. Barnes' hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from everything he'd been holding in. "You don't get it. You people never do. You play the victim, you destroy everything, and the world just hands you sympathy." His words came out slurred with rage, his chest heaving. Jamal's fear was giving way to anger. "You pulled a gun on me for walking home. You think I destroyed you. You did that yourself." That line, those words, hit Barnes like a spark to gasoline. He took one step forward, then another. His hand went to his waistband where his holster used to be, but it wasn't there. He'd left his gun at home, or so he thought. He wasn't supposed to have one anymore, but he couldn't let it go. He told himself it was for protection. The rain poured harder, drumming against the car, against the street, against Jamal's racing heart. He could see the outline of the gun under Barnes' jacket now. Panic shot through him. "Stay back," Jamal shouted, hands up just like that night. Don't come any closer." Barnes' breathing turned shallow. His face twisted, not in thought, but in something darker, regret mixed with fury, the kind that turns reason into noise. "You think I'm scared of you?" he said softly. "You think I'll let you and your mother walk away from this?" And then it happened. A sound so sharp it cut through the storm, a single gunshot. For a moment everything stopped. The rain hung in the air, the streetlight buzzed, and the echo of the shot rolled down the street like thunder. Jamal staggered back, confusion on his face before pain replaced it. His hand went to his chest. His eyes met Barnes', wide, disbelieving, terrified. Then he collapsed onto the wet asphalt. Barnes froze, his mind blank. The gun was still smoking in his hand, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the rain. He hadn't meant to. He didn't even remember pulling the trigger. His pulse roared in his ears. He dropped to his knees beside the boy, panic clawing at his throat. "No, no, no, God, no!" His voice broke as he pressed his hands against the wound, but the blood kept spilling dark and fast. "Stay with me, please." His own words sounded like a stranger's. He looked around, desperate. No one, no lights, just the rain washing away what he'd done. He could still fix this. He told himself that. He could make it look like an accident, self-defense, anything. He dragged Jamal's body toward the curb, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He was still trying to think, trying to breathe, when headlights appeared at the far end of the street. Renee's car. She'd gotten worried when Jamal didn't respond. She'd driven through half the neighborhood, her gut twisting tighter with every unanswered call. When she turned the corner, the scene came into view, her son on the ground, the man kneeling over him. For a split second, her mind couldn't make sense of it. Then the scream tore from her throat before she even realized it was hers. "Jamal." Barnes looked up, drenched and trembling, his face pale under the streetlight. "It was an accident," he stammered. He came at me." But she wasn't listening. She was already on the ground beside her son, her hands pressed over his wound, her voice breaking as she whispered his name over and over. The badge around her neck clinked against the pavement, useless now. Jamal's lips moved faintly, a whisper lost in the rain. Then nothing. Renee's world collapsed in on itself. The rain, the blood, the gun, it all blurred together. Her chest felt hollow, like something had been ripped out of her. She looked up at Barnes, her face twisted with disbelief and hate. "You killed my son." He took a step back, hands trembling, words spilling from his mouth without meaning. I swear, I didn't mean to." But she saw no man, only the monster who had taken everything. In the minutes that followed, the chaos began. Sirens, flashing lights, neighbors at their windows. The same street, the same lights as before, but this time there was no stopping the tragedy. Officers surrounded the scene, shouting orders. Renee didn't move. She sat in the rain, holding Jamal's body, her hands stained red. When someone tried to pull her away, she snapped, her voice raw, "Don't touch him." Barnes stood by his car, hands raised, eyes empty. He looked at the woman who had once been his colleague in law enforcement and knew there was no explaining this away. The words self-defense would sound hollow, the excuses meaningless. He crossed the line between fear and hate, and there was no coming back. When they cuffed him, he didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just stared at the rain as it washed the blood from his hands. Renee was silent as the medics lifted Jamal's body onto the stretcher. Her badge was still around her neck, gleaming faintly under the police lights. It used to mean justice. Now it felt like a lie. The night air was thick with grief and disbelief. People whispered from their porches, some crying, some recording. Another name, another boy, another mother broken in the street. As the ambulance pulled away, Renee stood there, motionless, soaked to the bone. The streetlight above her flickered once, then went out, plunging the scene into shadow. The crime wasn't just the bullet that took her son. It was everything that led to it. The anger, the fear, the power that had always been one-sided. And now, in the rain-soaked silence, the truth was undeniable. The system she had trusted all her life had just murdered her only child. The morning after the shooting, Ridgeway Heights didn't feel like the same place. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the yellow tape and flashing lights that lined Maple Street. Reporters had gathered before sunrise, their vans parked crookedly along the sidewalks. The story had already hit every local news channel, and by noon it was everywhere. Former police officer shoots son of FBI agent. The words looked unreal on screens, but the scene was very real, and it hung heavy over the neighborhood like a fog that wouldn't lift. Renee didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of the gun, the fall, the blood running with the rain. Her house was full of people, agents, colleagues, neighbors, but she barely heard them. She sat at the kitchen table, her son's jacket folded beside her, holding onto it as if it could still keep him warm. The official statement started within hours. The department promised a full and impartial investigation. The words sounded practiced, rehearsed, and meaningless. Renee had written statements like that herself years ago. She knew what they were worth. She didn't care about justice in the abstract anymore. She wanted accountability. She wanted someone to look her in the eye and admit what the world already knew, that Jamal had been murdered for no reason other than existing in the wrong skin at the wrong time. Barnes sat alone in an interrogation room miles away, his soaked clothes replaced with gray sweats. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a hollow, sick feeling. He couldn't stop seeing the boy's face. The way he'd looked up at him right before he fell. It wasn't supposed to go that way. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. But every time he tried to tell himself it was an accident, another part of him whispered the truth. He'd wanted to feel control again. He wanted someone to pay for the life that had crumbled around him. When detectives came in to take his statement, his words stumbled over themselves. "He came at me," he said at first. "I was afraid." But the tremor in his voice gave him away. The officers didn't respond, didn't nod, they just wrote in silence. One of them looked up once and said quietly, "You were following him, that's on dash cam." Barnes dropped his head into his hands. There was no defense for that, no badge to hide behind anymore. Just the sound of his own breath and the distant click of a camera capturing the wreckage of his life. By the second day, the media had turned Jamal's story into a symbol. His photo, smiling, wearing his basketball jersey, was everywhere. On news channels, on posters, online hashtags, people who had never met him were marching in the streets, holding candles, chanting his name. His mother's position in the FBI made it even bigger, a headline that crossed from local outrage to national conversation. But for Renee, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like her son had become another case file, another hashtag in a system that consumed tragedies and forgot the names behind them. Inside her home, the air was thick with silence. Jamal's room was exactly as he left it, his sneakers by the door, homework still spread across his desk. She stood there one night, touching the back of his chair, her fingers trembling. It hit her then, not just that he was gone, but that she had built her entire life believing in rules and systems that didn't protect him. When colleagues came to check on her, she stayed polite but distant. They told her she'd be given leave with pay and offered counseling, but she refused. "You can't fix this," she said flatly. "Don't pretend you can." At the precinct, Barnes' name was spoken in low tones. Some officers felt sorry for him. Others called him what he was, a disgrace. The department tried to distance itself quickly, releasing statements about independent review and community healing. But behind closed doors, the unease grew. They all knew how it looked, how it was. Another example of everything people had been screaming about for years. Barnes' wife didn't come to see him. She'd taken their daughter and left the state 2 days after the shooting. The divorce papers came through within a week. He spent his days in holding, replaying every moment of that night until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. The sound of the rain, the flash of the gun, the mother's scream, it all blended together. Sometimes he tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat. Sometimes he told himself he'd been provoked, that it was self-defense, but even that lie couldn't hold. Deep down, he knew he hadn't been afraid of Jamal. He'd been afraid of himself, of what he'd become. The funeral came 3 days later. The church was packed, friends, classmates, community members, and strangers who had only known Jamal through screens. The air inside was heavy with grief and disbelief. Renee stood at the front, dressed in black, her FBI badge tucked away where no one could see it. She didn't want to be an agent today. She just wanted to be a mother. When she stepped up to speak, her voice cracked on the first word. "My son," she paused, swallowing the ache that burned in her throat. "He was kind, he was gentle, he didn't deserve to die because someone couldn't see past a hoodie in the rain." People wept openly, cameras recorded every moment. But for Renee, the world outside that church didn't exist. All she could see was the empty space where her son should have been sitting. In the days that followed, protests grew. The FBI opened a federal investigation. The mayor issued statements about reform and rebuilding trust. It all felt like noise. Renee's house became both a memorial and a battleground, flowers and candles on one side, media vans and flashing lights on the other. At night, when everyone was gone, she would sit by Jamal's window and stare at the street below. The same street where it happened. Sometimes she swore she could still hear his footsteps on the pavement, the rhythm of his runs echoing faintly through the quiet. Meanwhile, Barnes' trial moved faster than anyone expected. The evidence was clear: dashcam footage, gunshot residue, and witness statements. His own words from the interrogation room sealed his fate. The jury didn't take long. Guilty, second-degree murder. When the verdict was read, he didn't look up. He didn't argue. He just nodded like it was the only thing left that made sense. As they let him out, reporters shouted questions he couldn't answer. Inside, he felt nothing, just a hollow space where his anger used to live. Renee didn't attend the sentencing. She couldn't bear to look at him again. Instead, she sat by Jamal's grave, tracing his name on the stone. Around her, the world kept moving, cars passing, birds singing, life going on as if it hadn't shattered completely. In the months that followed, the story faded from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new faces. But in Ridgeway Heights, the wound never closed. Neighbors who once waved at each other now crossed the street in silence. The park where kids used to play felt empty. Renee eventually returned to work, but something in her had changed. The calm professionalism that once defined her was gone. She spoke bluntly in meetings, refused to gloss over bias in cases, and called out injustice even when it made others uncomfortable. She'd lost faith in the system, but not in the fight. If she couldn't save her son, she'd make damn sure no one else would lose theirs the same way. Late one night, as she was leaving the office, she paused outside under the same kind of rain that had fallen that night. It soaked her coat, but she didn't move. For the first time in months, she closed her eyes and let herself feel it all, the grief, the anger, the exhaustion. The sound of the rain wasn't cruel anymore. It was quiet, soft, like her son was still out there somewhere, running through it free. And in that moment, even with the pain still raw, she whispered to the night, "I'll keep fighting, Jamal, I promise." The world around her was still broken, still unjust, but her voice didn't shake when she said it. Because for the first time since that night, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to rise from the ruins. In the months following the trial, Ridgeway Heights slowly began to return to its quiet routines, but something intangible had changed forever. The neighborhood still looked the same. The trimmed lawns, the mailboxes with peeling paint, the soft hum of sprinklers at dawn. But beneath that surface calm lingered a silence too heavy to ignore. It wasn't the kind of peace that came after closure. It was the kind that settled after loss, when people had stopped speaking, not because they had nothing left to say, but because they no longer knew what words could mean. The legal outcome was clear enough. Former officer Daniel Barnes was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, eligible for parole after 15. The judge's tone was even almost clinical when delivering the sentence. "This court recognizes the tragedy of this case," he said, "and the irreparable harm it has caused to all involved." Barnes didn't argue or plead for leniency. He only nodded once, his expression distant, as though the man who had once believed himself protector of a community had already disappeared long before the verdict. In prison, Barnes kept mostly to himself. He avoided altercations, spent his days working in the library, and wrote letters that he never sent. Every so often, he'd start one addressed to Renee, only to tear it up before finishing. There were no words that could undo what he'd done, no apology large enough to fill the space he'd carved out in her life. With each passing year, he became quieter, more faded. The walls of his cell became the only world he knew, an echo of the confinement he had once imposed on others. Renee, meanwhile, carried her grief with the same precision she once carried her badge. She returned to the FBI not because she was ready, but because she refused to let the system she'd served define the last chapter of her story. Her presence changed the tone of every room she entered. Agents who once spoke casually about statistics now paused before using that word. Supervisors who had once brushed off implicit bias now flinched under her unrelenting questions. But for Renee, it was no longer about politics or image, it was about humanity. She poured her pain into policy reform, quietly but forcefully pushing for better training, transparency, and accountability. She became a mentor to younger recruits, especially women of color who felt the same isolation she once had. Her grief had not softened her, it had sharpened her. What began as mourning turned into purpose. At home, though, the silence never left. Her house remained a museum of memory, framed photos of Jamal, his trophies, his guitar resting against the wall. Sometimes she caught herself listening for the sound of his laugh or the creak of the stairs late at night. She'd stand by the window during storms, the rain sliding down the glass, and think about how something so ordinary could hold so much pain. The community's response unfolded in layers. In the weeks after the verdict, protests gave way to community meetings, forums, and marches that turned from outrage to dialogue. The story became a case study in policing, race, and accountability, discussed in classrooms, documentaries, and training seminars. Jamal's name became synonymous with reform, an emblem of everything society needed to confront. Yet beneath all the public activism, there was a quiet, more personal shift. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations now found themselves talking about fear, prejudice, and the blind spots they hadn't known they carried. The tragedy forced them to see each other differently, to understand that safety could not exist without empathy, and justice could not exist without truth. Still, the change wasn't universal. Some resisted, clinging to the familiar narrative of a tragic misunderstanding. Online debates raged, dividing communities further. For every candlelight vigil, there was a comment section full of denial and vitriol. It became painfully clear that progress was not a straight line. It was a constant fight against the very structures people took comfort in. For Renee, that realization became both her burden and her fuel. She began speaking publicly not as an agent, but as a mother. Her speeches were raw, stripped of bureaucratic language. She didn't talk about policy outcomes or social justice metrics. She talked about her son, about his smile, his future, his absence, about the man who killed him and the world that made him believe he could. Her words carried weight because they were rooted in truth, not vengeance. "Justice isn't a verdict," she said at one community forum. "It's a mirror. It shows us who we are when no one's watching, and for too long we've been afraid to look." In time, her efforts inspired others. Scholarships were founded in Jamal's name. Youth programs emerged to bridge gaps between law enforcement and marginalized neighborhoods. The same streets that once echoed with protest chants now held candlelight vigils that honored, not just grief, but hope. But even as change began to take root, the story of Ridgeway Heights remained a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that violence didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew quietly, watered by fear, resentment, and the illusion of power. Barnes hadn't been born a monster. He had become one through years of unchecked bitterness and disillusionment. And Renee's story reminded the world that even strength had its breaking point when justice failed to protect those it promised to serve. On the one-year anniversary of Jamal's death, the sky mirrored that same soft rain from the night of the shooting. Renee stood by his grave with a small group of friends and supporters. She spoke softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "You're not forgotten," she whispered. "You never will be." In that moment, the rain felt different, not a reminder of loss, but of renewal. It fell on the grass, the stone, the flowers, washing away the dust of another year while carrying forward the memory of what had been lost. As she turned to leave, she paused, looking out at the city beyond the cemetery, the skyline faintly visible through the mist. The world still felt fractured, but not beyond repair. Maybe that was the only kind of justice humanity could ever hope for, not perfection, but persistence, not closure, but courage. The case of Daniel Barnes and Jamal Carter would be studied for years, debated by scholars, cited by activists, and remembered by mothers. It revealed the deepest contradictions in human nature, the capacity for fear and compassion, for destruction and redemption. It forced people to confront questions they'd long avoided. What does it mean to protect? Who gets to feel safe? And at what cost? Renee's final reflection, written in a letter she never shared publicly, captured the essence of everything that had happened. We all want to believe in good and evil, in heroes and villains, but the truth is harder. The truth is that evil often wears the face of ordinary men. Justice isn't a verdict. It's the work we do after the verdict every single day to make the world less cruel. I still believe in that work. I have to. It's the only way to keep his memory alive. And so the story of Ridgeway Heights closed not with resolution, but with reckoning. A mother's love turned into a legacy, a broken system forced to confront itself, and a tragedy that, even in its sorrow, left behind the faint, stubborn light of change. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest failures, there remains the possibility of redemption if only enough people choose to see it.